So the question I have for you today relates to where I started out with this morning, is that when you think about your past, or when you just kind of think, when you're just kind of being quiet, what's that thing that comes to mind that still haunts you? That it's some decision that you made, some activity you participated in, something that you had to do or thought you had to do or felt like you had to do, but now as you look back on it, it weighs on you. You wish that moment had not have happened the way that it did. You wish you could go back and live it again, but do it differently this time. I think we all have those experiences, right? And when we think about that moment, hopefully you don't have too many of them. Some of us have lots of them, right? But when you think about that moment, how does it make you feel? Right? It doesn't make us feel good, and we just wish we could do it over again. And the thing I want to talk about this morning is that this idea that we might be able to have a fresh start. That I believe there is a way to move beyond those things that are so hard to forgive ourselves for. So this morning, as we wrap up the series we've been in, New Beginnings, that's what I want to talk about, is something really new, like giving yourself a fresh start, moving beyond those memories that hold us back and that hurt us, and where we might have hurt other people. Now remember that the point in this series is this idea that we are all on a journey of faith throughout in our entire lives, right? Whether you're someone who cannot remember a time when you didn't believe in Jesus, as far back as you can remember, you've always believed in Jesus. Maybe you just recently began to believe in Jesus. Maybe you're not sure you believe that Jesus is who he says he is, right? And no matter where you are on that, we all go through a period of transition. There are times where it's easier to believe. There are times where it just seems harder to believe. But I think the thing is also that as we go on this journey, our understandings start to change. Right? As we have new experiences, as we come to church together and we study God's Word, as we spend quiet time in prayer, as we read the Word on our own, and then we have experiences in life that kind of cause us to see, oh, that's what that meant. That's how I apply that in my life. That's how God works in this situation, right? So we're on this journey, but there's this thing that really seems to catch us, right? That even as we embrace Jesus' forgiveness for us, we can struggle to forgive ourselves. I mean, I've had people say to me that Jesus cannot forgive me for that they can't even get to that point in it. And I can assure them that he does. But there's a somewhat famous saying, I wish I'd made this up. I have not. Someone smarter than me did. That logic cannot overpower an emotion. Right? I can give you all kinds of scriptural evidence. I can kind of point to all sorts of things. But if our emotions say, no, that one's just too bad, I just can't move past it. And then even if Jesus forgives me, I can't forgive myself. We can find ourselves stuck. But I believe that we can move past that. I believe it's worth moving past that. I believe that our lives can be incredibly different if we're willing to move past it. That our own experience and our relationship with ourselves can become very different. If we can move past those things, I believe our relationship with God and with Jesus can become much more deep, because we don't hold back, that we're actually willing to walk with confidence towards our King. And our relationship with other people, I think, can also get better. Because when we have things inside of us that we can't let go of, they seem to shape the way we see ourselves and can often shape the way we interact with people around us. So as we go through this today, I'm going to continue this kind of pattern that I've been doing throughout the series. Does anybody know what the thing that's shown up in all of them except the introduction one? Jesus going to dinner. I should have called this series like Dining Out with Jesus or something. Right? Because if you look at it each time, we look at Jesus kind of sitting down to dinner with somebody and talking about something. Right now, several times he's been sitting down with religious leaders and talking about things. And we also talk about the very famous dinner he had, that final dinner, the Last Supper, where he talks to his followers about things. And today we're going to have both of those situations. We're going to start out with Jesus being at dinner with a religious leader, and then we're going to wrap it up as we see what Jesus says to his followers in that Last Supper that applies to all this. Now, this first dinner is with a guy named Simon. Now, Simon was a religious leader at that time, and Simon invites Jesus to dinner. And as Jesus arrives at Simon's home, There are other guests there as well. And as Jesus comes in, as we read it, if we read the account of it, to us it doesn't seem like a big deal. Jesus kind of comes in and goes to the table. But what we find is there were courtesies that Jesus should have had extended to him. That in polite company, what you would normally do, remember this is a desert environment with everybody walking around with sandals on. So what you would do is when someone came in, it would be common to kind of just give them a kiss on the cheek to welcome there. You would then extend the opportunity to wash their feet because it's dusty and it's dirty. And even maybe put oil on your head, right? Kind of just freshen your head up, kind of fix your hair sort of thing. And none of these things are extended to Jesus. Now, we don't know why, or we don't know why yet, anyway. And so Jesus comes in, and what the narrative tells us is that Jesus reclines at the table. And notice it doesn't say that he sits at the table. And that's actually really important as we get into the rest of the narrative, right? Because when we go to dinner, right, we sit in a chair and we face the table. But in the first century, a common way that you dined with someone, particularly if they were more formal, was to do what's called reclining. What you would do is something like this. Right? If you look at the way the men are, they're actually laying, in this case, on a couch. Sometimes it might be on a cushion. And you would lay on one side, and you would eat the food with your other hand. In fact, in the most formal settings, there would be 3 of these kind of couches around. The most important person would be in the center, at the top one. And then basically, your rank of importance would relate to where you were on the couches. Right? So Jesus is reclining, and this is important because when he's sitting there, or when he's reclining there, his feet are not underneath of him. His feet are sticking out on the end of the couch. And so as he's reclining there, and we jump into the narrative, it tells us that a woman walks in. Now, based on the research I've done, it was actually not uncommon when a group of religious leaders would come together to kind of have a discussion or a debate, they would leave the home open so people could come watch them and see how smart they are. Right, to kind of hear this great conversation that they would have. Also, there were times where people who were poor would be allowed to take leftovers. So it wouldn't be that unusual for someone just to kind of come in. And we don't know much about this woman who comes in. She's described in one way. She had led a sinful life. That's all we know about her. Now, a sinful life could be all sorts of things. It could be anything as simple as not following religious traditions, or things much more significant than that. We kind of get the impression that it's probably more significant than that, but we don't actually know. Right now, she comes in. It says that she stood behind Jesus at his feet, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. So she pours out this expensive perfume on his feet. She cleans them with her tears, wipes it with her hair. And the thing that's kind of interesting is that the narrative never explicitly says this, but we get the impression that she'd had some kind of prior experience with Jesus. We don't know if it was a personal encounter that she had with him, or possibly he was just teaching and what he taught moved her deeply. But whatever the case is, that because of this experience with Jesus, she has shown up, with emotions just flowing out of her and wanting to share these emotions with Jesus. Now, what I would like to invite you to do is imagine you're having dinner at someone's home, and someone walks in and goes to one of your guests and begins wiping their feet off with their hair, dumping perfume on it. Would that be awkward to you? That would be just as awkward to them. Right? This is the thing I always like to remind us of. Right? These are real people. Right? These are Bible people. They're not different kinds of people. Right? This is a really awkward experience going on. And Simon and his guests are incredibly uncomfortable about it. Like, what is she doing? Particularly the kind of woman that she is. What is she doing? But Jesus doesn't appear uncomfortable with it. Jesus actually seems okay with it. And the fact that Jesus is okay with it makes Simon even more not okay. Right? Simon's getting really upset. And it goes on to say that when the Pharisee, in other words, when Simon, who had invited Jesus, saw this, Simon said to himself, if this man were a prophet, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. other words, she's a bad person. Right? We're a bunch of good people. Good people don't hang out with bad people. If Jesus was a good person, or I like to say if Jesus was a good people, he wouldn't want this kind of behavior from a bad people. See, he can't be of God. Right? He can't be any good. And I think this gets to the heart of a challenge that we all face. That sometimes we seem to see the world, in a binary fashion. Right? Us and them, the good people, the bad people. And we like to think that we're good people. But then when we look at things that we've done in our lives, or sometimes something that we do in our lives, we go, well, that's not a good people thing. Maybe I'm not a good people. Maybe I'm a bad people. And we start to get weighed down. Because we start to say that we start to see ourselves as the things that we have done. Right? We all fail, but failing doesn't make you a failure. Right? We all do things that hurt people. We do things that hurt ourselves. We do things that are counter to what God would have us do. We do things that the people we love would rather we didn't do. But those things don't have to define our entire lives. That we don't want to get caught up in this idea that I have to be on this side of the line, the good side of the line, or the bad side of the line. Right? The reality is that we're all both. We're all both. Right? We try, as we pursue Jesus in our life, we try to follow his teaching, and does that make us a good person? I guess kind of. But if that was true, then when I get it wrong, then I must be a bad person. And that's not true. Right? The reality is we are all on a journey. Right? And we're all learning. And we're starting to understand what Jesus is calling us to more and more as we engage with him, as we encounter the scriptures, encounter those things in our lives that help us understand them. So we're all growing. Right? That we're not, I would want to encourage all of us, as we look at ourselves, as we look at other people, don't try to put people into buckets. That they're good or they're bad, they're right or they're wrong, they're Democrat or Republican. Oh no. Right? Has that not become the definition of our culture? Are you in or you out? Are you us or you them? Are you right or you're wrong? Right? That Jesus invites us to something much richer than that. Jesus invites us into a journey of growth. We don't get it right all the time. We might get it wrong for quite a bit of time. But he always invites us into renewal, to find something deeper. Now, getting back to our narrative, Jesus is aware of what Simon is thinking. He's aware that Simon's kind of thinking about what he's thinking about him, what he's thinking about Jesus, and what Simon is thinking about the woman. And so Jesus just kind of turns to Simon and says, hey, Simon, I want to tell you something. And then Jesus begins to tell a very short parable. And remember, a parable is simply a fictional story that has a point. So as Jesus starts the parable, he says, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Now, basically what that means is that one person owed about 500 days' wages, so nearly a year and a half's worth of wages, a nearly impossible debt to pay. The other one owed 50 days' wages, about a month and a half. It would still be a really hard debt to pay, right, but kind of 1/10 of that of the others. So Jesus lays this out, and he says, well, neither of them had the money to pay the money lender back. So he forgave the debts of both. So as Jesus tells this story, he then turns to Simon and says, Simon, I want to ask you something. Which of them will love that money lender more? And I think Simon's kind of taken back from that because he wasn't really expecting the question. So Simon says, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. And Jesus says, you have judged correctly. And what's kind of interesting is that Jesus is saying in this parable, and it's not something that I would have thought of on my own, and I don't think Simon was anywhere near this. But Jesus is saying that there is some sort of relationship between forgiveness and love. And we might think that means that, okay, well, if I love someone, that person is willing to forgive me. But Jesus is saying that something the opposite happens. That when we are forgiven, that response to that is love. But I think a key part of that is that not only is the response to that love when we've been forgiven, but we've got to realize that we've been forgiven. And we've got to recognize how much we've been forgiven. And that parable only works when the one person says, well, I've been forgiven for 10 times as much as that person. And I can't believe how much he was willing to forgive me. That there's a relationship with recognizing what we've been forgiven from. And in response to that, we display love towards a person. Now, as Jesus lays that out, he then goes, okay, so if that's the case, and I'm saying it is the case, he starts to go through how the woman has treated Jesus and how Simon has treated Jesus. So he lists the things that Simon did not do. Right? Simon did not even do the minimum. He didn't offer the basic courtesies of greeting someone with pleasantries, with a kiss at that time, offering the chance to rinse off his feet or freshen up his hair. Meanwhile, this entire time, this woman has not stopped crying, right? Just emotions of love are pouring out from her, and she's anointing Jesus' feet. She's displaying this extraordinary act of love. And then Jesus says that this is what her actions show. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But for whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Now, the thing is that this shows not just how much she's been forgiven of, but the fact that she understands how much she's been forgiven of. And one of the things that Jesus wants to make abundantly clear, that it's no action on her part that has led to Jesus' forgiveness. Right? Because she's falling, kind of flowing with love towards Jesus because she's recognizing that Jesus has forgiven her. And Jesus wants to make really clear, she has done nothing to earn this. Jesus turns to her and says, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And so what we're seeing is this kind of interesting thing that I think that Jesus is clarifying for us really well. Right? That there was no action on the woman's part that led to her being forgiven. Right? This display of love for Jesus had nothing to do with her receiving forgiveness itself. Right? It was her faith in Jesus that caused her to be forgiven, because that's how salvation is extended to all of us. The faith in the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, and he has the power to forgive our sins. So what she did not cause her forgiveness, but what she did was actually a direct result of that forgiveness. And it shows the fact that she actually understands that. And that's the thing I want each of us to try to hold on to here, that as we look at our lives, and if we have actually put our faith in Jesus, and we have asked for his forgiveness, he has forgiven you. And our response to that should be love and gratitude. Right? Not weak worm of the dust writhing on the ground gratitude, but a recognition that we have been forgiven. And there's a peace in that. And that we can move beyond that. That our past is our past. That we don't have to be stuck in regret. That God can use those things in your past that you might be most ashamed of to do something in your life. God has moved so large in my life based on so many of the things that I got wrong that I never thought could be redeemed. As I was led into the prison ministry and, understood some of the things they were dealing with better than I should, sort of thing. Than a good people should anyway. Right? Because God will redeem it, that the things that we regret so heavily, when we actually turn them over to Jesus, he not just forgives us of them, he not just forgives us of them, but he will redeem them, and he will use them. And he will build something off of all that, if we will let him. But now what about Simon? Right? Simon didn't really demonstrate much love. Jesus kind of made that really, really clear. So does that mean that Simon had fewer sins than the woman did? I mean, Jesus kind of who were really the only people Jesus really had confrontations with? Religious leaders. Right? Because the religious leaders focused on religious rules, religious traditions, right? They kept the Sabbath. They tithed, they fasted, they did all kinds of religious things. They kept themselves ceremonially clean, all these sort of things. But just a couple weeks ago, we were talking about this, right? But when Jesus went to the religious leaders, he said, yes, you do all those things, and those things are important, but you're neglecting what's more important. In fact, he says, you neglect what's most important, which was caring for people, reaching out to people in need, supporting people, lightening people's burdens. And Jesus said, you're missing what's most important. See, here's the thing. It's not that the religious leader sinned less than she did. It's just his sins were more socially acceptable. Right? Walking by a beggar on the side, nobody saw that as a problem because you were keeping the schedule to get to the synagogue on time. Right? Not caring for people, not feeding the hungry. Yes, I'm tithing. In fact, if you do a deep study on the behavior of many of the first century religious leaders, they would often use religious traditions, man-made traditions, to avoid doing things they know they should do. I mean, one of the things Jesus lays into some of them for is not caring for their parents as they age. And they would say, well, I promised that money to God. Now, I can use it until I die, but I promised that money to God, so I can't help my parents. Right? These sort of things were what they did all the time. And so the thing is not that they sinned less. The thing is that they just sinned differently in a way that fits in with the societal expectations of the time. Right? The thing that Jesus makes abundantly clear, that the most important thing we are to do is to care about people, care for people, walk with people in life. And when we have those opportunities, we are called to do those things. Yet we live in a culture that values expensive cars and big houses and showing off power and getting all you can. And Jesus is saying that when we do those sort of things, we don't recognize our need to be forgiven. See, the issue is not so much about how much you sinned and the response to that. It's the recognition that you've been forgiven for it. And from that flows love. And that love can be demonstrated by action. That what we do with what we've been given demonstrates the level that we understand what we've received. Right, as Jesus is sitting here at Simon's house in this dinner, he's using the parable and the behavior of this woman to demonstrate those things, contrasting how she behaves versus Simon. And then sometime later, as he nears the end of his earthly ministry, Jesus would be sitting down to that dinner we call the Last Supper. And he would begin to make these same points much more specifically to his apostles, to his closest followers. The same points I believe he makes to all of us. Because as Jesus is sitting at that dinner, as he kind of lays things out for his apostles, and remember the issue is that he tells them that he's leaving, and they're getting really upset, and they don't know what they're going to do. And he reminds them of the things that are important. He reminds them of what he has taught them. He tells them that God will be with them. And he also reminds them of the things that they've received and what he's calling them to do with their lives. So in the midst of that, Jesus makes this statement. He says, "Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me." Now, Jesus makes that point a lot about love and keeping his commands. But normally he makes it as more of a directive, right? He normally says, well, if you love me, keep my commands. But notice what he's saying here. That if you keep my commands, that shows that you love me. That the evidence that you love me, the evidence that you recognize what you've received, is love for me. In other words, you recognize what you received, you have gratitude for it. And he says that if you love me, there will be action. You will keep my commands. And what was the core command that Jesus gave his followers? Love others as I have loved you. The call into each of our lives, when we put our faith in Jesus and he forgives our sins, is to recognize the enormity of the gift that we are given. Respond with gratitude. That gratitude generates love, and that love leads to action. The way we demonstrate love for God, the way we demonstrate love for Jesus is by loving other people. Jesus says that will be the evidence That you understand what you've been given. That's the evidence. And the thing is that as we embrace this idea of forgiveness, because as we love people, we forgive them, right? Even when it's hard, we forgive them, or we try to forgive them. We talked a ton about that last week, right? But as we're talking about this idea of loving, right, and love others as you love yourselves is something else Jesus tells us to do. Well, if we love others and we forgive them, if we love others and we love ourselves, we've also got to be willing to forgive ourselves, right? Because we all get stuck in that loop of unforgiveness, right? Even as we try to forgive other people, we will keep looping back to things that are in our lives that we can so easily get stuck saying that I cannot forgive myself for this, or Jesus won't forgive me for this. And what Jesus wants us to know is that he does forgive you if you ask. If you put your faith in him and you ask for his forgiveness, he extends it. And he wants you to live in the fullness of that. And if you don't embrace that to the point where you forgive yourself as well, you're never going to live in the fullness of all that we've been offered in Jesus. As I finish up, I want to look at again at something that we saw the Apostle Paul say last week that really kind of lays out, I think, kind of what our life would look like if we really could have an understanding of what we've been forgiven for. If we really could kind of grasp the gratitude that goes with it, the love that flows from that, how would we live? So Paul in his letters to a church in Ephesus says this. Paul says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Instead, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. So Jesus talks about all these emotions that we should get rid of, right? Malice and anger and slander. Well, do you ever slander yourself? What's that narrative in your head sometimes? It talks about being stupid. I can't believe I did it again. I always do this. What an idiot. Don't slander yourself. Don't hold malice towards yourself. Oh, if I was just different. It would be better if I was different. Don't do those things. Don't do them to other people. Don't do them to yourself. Be compassionate. Be forgiving. Forgiving of others. Forgiving of yourself. God has already forgiven you through Jesus. Embrace that gift. Walk in the joy that that gift can bring into our lives. Because I said this at the beginning. I think I've said it like 3 or 4 times now. But the key to really being free, to really being able to lean into our relationship with Jesus is to forgive ourselves for the things he's forgiven us for. Because as long as you're holding on to that, you're going to be hesitant to move closer. But if you can start to let go of it, to just trust that he's got it, he forgave you, he took care of it, he'll use it. Move on from it. You know, and I've talked about this before in a previous series this year, and I just want to kind of touch on this a little bit. A key part of being able to really forgive ourselves about the things we've done is to follow a healthy process of doing that. Right? That one of the things that really holds us down when we've done something in our past and we can't move past it is it kind of keeps replaying, but if we can actually share it with someone else. When we talk about the idea that we confess to someone, it doesn't mean you have to go to a priest, it doesn't mean you have to come to me. Right? You go to someone you trust and have someone in your life that you trust and tell them the things that you have done. You will be amazed as how much that unburdens you. And as part of loving others, we need to, make reparations for harm that we've done. Right? If you've hurt someone in that thing that you regret, you got to apologize to them if at all possible. They may not receive it. Right? They may actually hate you forever. But we still have to make that gesture. And if we broke something or took something, we got to fix it or replace it. Right? The fact that God forgives us and the fact that we need to forgive ourselves doesn't relieve us of this call to love others. And if we've harmed someone, a part of our own healing is to bring restoration into those that we have harmed where we can. We can't always do that, or sometimes trying to do it can create its own set of harm. But we're not to live. If loving others doesn't mean God has forgiven me, I'm not responsible for anything I did. It just means it doesn't hold over your head forever. That Jesus can move on from it, that we can move on from it. But we've got to do our part in loving others to recognize that we still have responsibilities. But the thing that I would like us to recognize is that if we think about the things we've talked about over this past few weeks, about being on a journey, this idea of forgiveness and growing with God and learning to forgive ourselves, this is a path to freedom. You know, I've talked to so many people over the years who have been believers their whole lives. They still have things in their life that they believe God will never fully forgive them for, or they can't forgive themselves. And that's a burden that you don't need to carry because someone else is already carrying it for you. So my invitation to each of us is to embrace this gift and walk in the joy that it can bring us.